All right, yeah. I'm going to talk about something that I think is a really, really cool topic, which is ancient astronomy and trying to understand the way that people in ancient times thought about, you know, what we would call outer space or what they saw in the sky and things like that, and the way they pictured the globe and how things worked, because it was in many ways very different from the way we think about it now. So, after practicing math for many centuries, eventually the Babylonians got good enough to be able to record their observations of the sky and to be able to track things like the moon moving, you know, moving across the sky and how things would change, and they would be able to notice patterns and things like that. So this kind of technique was really went hand in hand with things that were we would consider to be not scientific. So they were doing things that seemed like science. They were taking measurements, they were making observations, they were coming up with ideas about the world and how things worked. But they were also mixing it in with things like astrology, which is mostly based on horoscopes. And they would do things like um, look at the stars on the night that you were born, and people would make predictions about what kind of fortunes you would have based on the location of the stars. And modern scientists today and modern astronomers today no longer believe that things like that. You know, we don't think that horoscopes are real. But in ancient times, it's important to understand that even though they were doing things that were kind of like astronomy, um, there were other parts to it as well, which were not really scientific. So at that time, they were kind of all blended together. Now, this way of thinking about the sky and thinking about astronomy heavily influenced the Egyptians and also, I would say more importantly, the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. And one person that is super important is Plato. And so a lot of the Babylonian astronomy, I think, probably peaked around 500 BC. And Plato came around 400 BC, and which is 100 years later, right? So he did he kind of he took some of these ideas and just ran with it. And his idea for the universe, which was shared by a lot of other Greeks and influenced by a lot of other Greek work, but I just want to present Plato's view of the universe, which is the two-sphere universe, or the two-sphere world, or two-sphere cosmology, two-sphere model. There's a lot of different names for it, but usually starts with the phrase two-sphere. And there's a good reason why it's called that. The idea is that you have the Earth, which is a sphere in the middle, and then you have a giant sphere around it, and that outer sphere contains the stars. So the stars are out here on a giant ball, and then you have another sphere, another ball, which is the Earth. Okay, so we're here, and the stars are here, and then the moon and the sun are in between, right? And that's very different from the picture we have now. Okay, but these kind of efforts in astronomy didn't just help people imagine the world, they also had practical things as well, or they influenced practical ideas. And one of the most important ones is the calendar. Okay? So, based on the amount of time it takes, in modern language, right, we know that the Earth rotates once every day, and we know it goes around the sun once every year. Now, the ancient people didn't think about it that way because they thought the Earth was sitting still and they thought things were spinning around us. But that doesn't change the length of a year, right? Like the seasons still happen the same way for them as they happen for us. So even though we think about the model differently, and even though we think about time a little differently, the seasons still happen. You know, there's still going to be a growing season in the spring and in the summer. There's still going to be a cold season in the winter in the northern hemisphere, and that doesn't change based on the way you view the world, right? So when they were thinking about this issue, a lot of the early calendars were heavily influenced by Babylonian math, which is based on the number 60. And an important number that comes out of that is the number 360. And even to this day, we use 360 as the number of degrees in a circle. And it comes all the way from those ancient times. So a lot of early calendars tried to say that there were 360 days in a year, but that turns out to not be enough. And so all the months get out of sync, and the calendar no longer becomes useful. So the Egyptians were probably the first people to kind of get a good grasp of this, and they added a 5-day holiday to their calendar. So the total number of days in the year became 365. And as it turns out, even that's not enough. It actually needs to be 365 and a quarter days. And eventually Julius Caesar reformed the calendar and used the help of Egyptian astronomers to add that extra quarter of a day by adding in leap years. So every 4th year, we get a bonus day so that the seasons stay synced up. And if you keep playing that game and looking at it, it turns out that the decimal keeps going. It's not 365.25. There's additional numbers there, and there's additional corrections that had to be made later. And they were made. But we'll stop there because this is about ancient stuff and not about things that happened too much later. All right, so before I end the video, I want to read an excerpt from Plato's Timaeus to give you a vibe or a feel for the way they were thinking, and pay attention to the way that some of these things sound scientific. He's talking about the structure of the earth, and he's using some scientific type terms that sound like early science, but also he's saying things that sound spiritual or religious or mythological, and he's mixing them all together. And so, I don't want to give anyone the false sense that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Babylonians and ancient Egyptians had a scientific process like ours. The way they thought about the world was very different. And at that point, kind of spiritual or supernatural beliefs were not separated from scientific beliefs. There wasn't these like two different ways of thinking about it. It was all just sort of one way of thinking about it. Okay? So I'm going to read a little excerpt, and we'll just kind of end with that. All right, so here's a small excerpt from Timaeus, and I'm getting this off of the classics.mit.edu website. This book was old 2,000 years ago. It's definitely a classic. A lot of really, really interesting insights into Greek thought and Greek culture and where a lot of our modern ideas come from. You can see them forming here. And so I'm going to read this little segment here. And he's talking about the world. He's talking about the earth. Wherefore he made the world in the form of a globe, round as from a lathe, having its extremes in every direction, equidistant from the center, the most perfect and the most like itself of all figures. For he considered that the like is infinitely fairer than the unlike. This he finished off, making the surface smooth all around for many reasons. In the first place, because the living being had no need of eyes, where there was nothing remaining outside him to be seen, nor of ears, when there was nothing to be heard. And there was no surrounding atmosphere to be breathed, nor would there have been any use of organs, by the help of which he might receive his food or get rid of what he had already digested, since there was nothing which went from him or came into him, for there was nothing beside him. Of design he was created thus, his own waste providing his own food, and all that he did or suffered taking place in and by himself. For the Creator conceived that a being which was self-sufficient would be far more excellent than one which lacked anything. And as he had no need to take anything or defend himself against anyone, the Creator did not think it necessary to bestow upon him hands, nor had he any need of feet, nor of the whole apparatus of walking. But the movement suited to his spherical form was assigned to him, being of all the seven that which is most appropriate to mind and intelligence. And he was made to move in the same manner and on the same spot, within his own limits, revolving in a circle. All the other 6 motions were taken away from him, and he was made not to partake of their deviations. And as this circular movement required no feet, the universe was created without legs and without feet. So this paragraph, this section here, Plato's talking about the earth, and he's talking about the earth being created and why it ended up being a sphere, the fact that it is alone and nothing, it doesn't eat anything, it doesn't need animal parts to it. But even thinking about the earth as if it's an animal is a strange concept to modern people, right? So we see a lot of early scientific type thinking, but we're hearing a story that sounds very mythological or very interesting, that involves referring to a supernatural creator. And also we see mentions of, like, to us it seems kind of crazy to think, why would you need to explain why the earth doesn't have arms or doesn't have organs or don't have things like that? And it gives you a sense of how ancient thinking was very different than our own, right? Anyway, that's a classic part of a very classic book. There's some really, really great stuff in here. So if you get time and you want to read something cool, go check it out. Lots of examples of lots of places to see it on the internet. Timaeus is an ancient book, so it's not copyrighted. Very easy to get your hands on it.